So, all right, it's with great pleasure that I introduce Nandaraja. So Nandaraja is a teacher at the London Buddhist Centre, a study leader for some of the Buddhafield sangha, a member of the teaching team at the Buddhafield Village Retreat, and an all-round wonderful being, I believe. So his wisdom, warmth and open-heartedness just shine, and his name means King of all joys, which feels to me to be really beautifully apt. So please join me in welcoming Nandaraja.
Hello, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Yes, I would like to share with you some of the fruits of my practice. So in a sense, it's quite personal, but I'm also glad, having sort of read other people, that it's not sort of uniquely my experience, and it's not sort of uniquely a Buddhist experience. So just going, just go back to the basics. The inspiration is from the Sevenfold Puja, the Triratna sort of Puja book, and there's two forms of the Heart Sutra. So there's one that we recite normally during the puja, and then there's a much more deeper one written at the end of the book that sort of explains a bit further from the Pali exactly the terms. So I would just like to explore with you. So this is not, I don't want you to see me as some kind of authority, or that that the view I'm presenting is the right view, or is the Triratna view, or something like that. It's more like what I'm sharing is a perspective, and that perspective may be useful to you. So what I'm offering is some tools that you might find useful for you to work with in your practice. So it's just it's an offering rather than a prescription or some kind of law. Oh, yeah. So I'd like you to take that, take it in that spirit. So the Heart Sutra, it's a kind of it's a commentary, but also a way of going deeper. And my exploration of it so far is that it's a pointer to something that goes behind concepts and language. And at the same time, it uses concepts and language. So that's that sort of inherent, apparent contradiction. And that apparent contradiction, it's not really a contradiction. It's more like, it's an accurate map of reality. And because reality is so vast, changing, and flows, and it doesn't necessarily admit logical consistencies. So the way we use language and the way we use concept, we tend to try and think in terms of terms that are logically consistent. If you're a fan of mathematics, you may have heard of Gödel's theorem. And he was a mathematical logician. And what he said was, any system of logic or mathematics has inherent things that cannot be described within it. And so the sort of holy grail of mathematics is to make everything beautifully consistent and logical, and sort of create a sort of firm bedrock of mathematics in which everything else is built on, physics, chemistry, and everything. And his theorems just show that actually reality wasn't really like that. And a lot of mathematicians, especially people like Cantor, sort of went mad trying to sort of figure out all these logical inconsistencies built into maths, which is meant to be sort of logically consistent and rational. So there is built into the very language we speak, a sense of duality, and we sort of take that for granted. And because we take that for granted, it sort of goes outside of our thinking. So part of studying the Dharma is kind of refining our thinking so we can think more clearly, more rationally, and then from there, we can go beyond that. But we have to start from where we are. Yeah, so we have to start from a rational basis, see the limitation of that, notice that it's a system, it has sort of built-in assumptions built into it, and by transcending those limitations, we come to something else. But we can't start off just saying what that something else is. We have to start from where we are. So the Heart Sutra, at the beginning, sort of goes like this. The bodhisattva of compassion, when meditating deeply, saw the emptiness of all 5 skandhas and sundered the bonds that caused him suffering. Okay, so I would just, so the 5 skandhas are then gone into the next verse. So here then, form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness no other than form. Form is only emptiness. Emptiness only form. Feeling, thought, and choice, consciousness itself, are the same as this. Okay, and then it goes on to the nature of voidness, on shunyata. Okay, so the 5 skandhas are just a traditional way of sort of labeling, if we investigate this sense of self or reality, and that is form. We have a form. So apparently, I have this form, and that this form that I have creates certain limitations. So because I have a human form, my sense of smell is not as good as that of a dog, or my sense of hearing is not as good as a dog. So whereas a dog can hear a dog whistle, for me, I can't. But the fact that I can't hear it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. But how can I tell if it's not in my awareness that it exists? And similarly, I can only see certain bands of light. So I cannot see ultraviolet light, and I cannot see infrared. But infrared, I can sense as heat. So that kind of exists for me. And we have sort of instruments that will allow us to sort of widen our perception to see more of the wavelengths, and so reality contains quite a lot of information, which just because I have a human form, I'm not aware of, and I can enhance it with certain scientific instruments. And usually those instruments came about because scientists developed found anomalies, and they tried to explain those anomalies. And because those anomalies existed, they had to create instruments that will allow them to sense what was behind the anomalies. So the equipment that we have are human beings, is that we have a form, we have our 6 senses, including the mind, and we also have feelings, thoughts, perceptions, volition, and then consciousness. And so those are the things that we have in which we model reality. So the Pali Canon and the early Buddhist teaching sort of gives us all kinds of tools in which to sort of examine the nature of our experience and to sort of broaden it and refine it so we come to a more accurate view of reality, right view. So it's usually, like most things, we cannot get to things directly. We need to go through elimination. So by noticing what our views are and eliminating wrong views from whatever is left, when we've eliminated all our wrong views, tends to be the right view. And then when we've eliminated even that, because that is itself a view, we come into non-view, okay? And once we come into non-view, the views of having views just breaks apart, yeah? But before we can get there, we have to work from our own direct experience, work from our own views. So our views are conditioned. Yeah, so that's just, yeah, we are conditioned beings. And what I would say is that if you're a conditioned being, then you are not perceiving reality as it is. Okay? So if we are going to come to a conundrum, is that how can you be aware of something you are not aware of? Yeah. And the process is that I find sort of useful is just to assume the possibility that I can be wrong. Yeah. So much of our time is spent defending our point of view, defending our perspective, defending our views of reality. And if we come from that position, what tends to happen is that we will label other people. And the simplest way of labeling other people is they're either mad or bad. So labeling somebody as mad means you can just ignore what they're saying. You know, you don't have to notice the feedback. You don't have to notice the inconsistencies that they're trying to inform you about. Yeah, so you remain blissfully ignorant. So that's one. That's the beauty of ignorance, that it defends itself by labeling things mad or bad. Because if they're mad, you can ignore them, and if they're bad, you can also ignore them. Yeah, because they're just mistaken. You know, and so the notion that other people are evil or bad just gives an excuse. And we've seen, history just teaches us what happens when you label people mad. Yeah, the instruments of torture that's kind of allowed because people are mad, and the instruments of torture that we use on people who are bad. Yeah. But that's not only what we do to other people, we do it to ourselves. Yeah. We can also label ourselves. So, am I going mad? Or am I a bad person? So we can punish ourselves. And again, the whole point of punishing ourselves is supposedly to make ourselves into a better person. I want to be a better person. But that is not helpful. That is an extreme view. And that sort of unawareness that comes into our mind when we subtly or even subtly label ourselves, label our experience as mad or bad, creates all kinds of distortions in our perception. So, you know, if we want to gain enlightenment for the benefit of all beings, we have to be very aware of the labels that we're imposing on ourselves and other people. And my experience is the labels we impose on ourselves tend to reflect in the labels we impose on other people. And the more we can kind of relax and be less rigid, or at least be aware when we're labeling that is what we're doing, and that is a choice that we are making. And then we can then examine the label and say, well, is it skillful or unskillful? Is it helpful? Is it kind? And by sort of noticing the labeling process that can go on automatically, we can then come into a different relationship. And that's sort of one of the sort of beauties of the metabhavana practice, the loving kindness practice. We may start off with a view of a difficult person as it's them, it's them. And all they need to do is change. And then our relationship will be different. But if we sort of practice, we may notice that we are part of the system, and we've created a system in which we're in a position with other people, and that actually they may be just like us, just from a different perspective, or they may be exhibiting behaviors that we find intolerable in ourselves, that we push or resist in ourselves. So it's much easier to do it with other people. And if we transform ourselves, that changes the dynamic, because who we are is in relationship with other people. So if we change ourselves, our relationship with other people will change. And it doesn't have to be either them or us. We can find a different way of operating in which we don't create any enemies within ourselves. And because there's no enemies within ourselves, there's no external enemies. Okay, so the fact that we kind of think in terms of a friend, a neutral person, a difficult person, they are sort of convenient labels to work with in our practice, but there's nothing permanent or solid or immutable about those. They're just labels, they're convenience. Yeah. And it's quite easy to switch from one or the other. And actually, what's my experience is other people are just mirrors of ourselves. Yeah. So what we find unacceptable in ourselves, we will tend to see in other people or notice it much more effectively. What we ignore in ourselves, we will notice more in other people. And so we can use this artificial distinction between self and others as a way of bridging, of sort of having a different view. So I'm not quite sure where this talk will end, but I would like to sort of introduce the notion of models, or maps. So I'm taking this from a book called Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson. And he goes into what he calls the 8 models for consciousness. And it has sort of very good parallels with some of the Dharma. But he talks about people inhabiting a reality tunnel. And so your reality tunnel is partly based on your observation of reality, but it's also, a lot of it is based on the models that you make about how reality is. Okay, so as an example, we have a sense of time as being kind of the same Yeah, if I ask you what the time was, we would basically have maybe the time is around this o'clock, okay? But as anybody who's done a Zoom meeting crossing international boundaries will find, one person will say, oh, right, I'm coming to this meeting and I'm just finishing up my breakfast. Another person will say, I'm just having my lunch. Another person will say, I'm having my dinner. And then the question is, well, what time is it? Yeah. Normally, we don't need to think about what time is it, because if we're in close proximity with the other person, we are sharing the same time. But that assumption as to what time is it is really dependent on where you are in the world. Yeah. Where you are in the world will give you what time it is. And then the question, well, who's right? Again, that question of who has the right time doesn't really apply in reality, simply because there's no right time. If you really want to know what the right time is, the time is now. Yeah, the time is now. Yeah? Any other time is just an arbitrary convenience. Somebody drew a line around the globe and said, this is Greenwich Mean Time, and then segmented into 24 bits, and then said, and then there's various anomalies depending on where you are in the world, and that's what the time is, okay? And similarly, so we can sort of assume so many things and not be aware of it. And part of the practice of meditation is sort of noticing the assumptions, the built-in assumptions that you tend to ignore. Yeah. And that sort of ignoring, that ignorance, if you're not aware of it, forms your thinking. And so you just assume that other people are sharing your reality. And if you assume that other people are sharing your reality, then obviously, if they are behaving in a way that is inconsistent with reality, they must be either mad or bad. There's nothing obvious about it. It's just an assumption. Yeah. And so can we sort of notice the labels that we're placing, and just notice how arbitrary those labels are, and that those labels are for convenience. So if you were to talk to somebody in England who was driving, and you say, well, which side of the road do you drive on? And then you talk to somebody living in the European continent and ask, which side of the road are you driving on? They will be driving on different sides of the road. But the reason we drive on one particular side of the road is just for convenience. It makes things easier if everybody uses that convention. Yeah. Yeah. But if you go around the world always driving on the right side of the road, you will come to a country in which you are driving on the wrong side of the road. And similarly, if you consistently only drive on the left side of the road, you will come to countries in which you are driving on the wrong side of the road. So the question of which is right or wrong, it's not really, we're not asking the right question. The question we should be asking is, what assumptions are we making? What conventions are we following that makes it easier to have these labels? But the labels are not real. Form, feeling, thoughts, choice, consciousness, they are labels, that pointed to something. They're not intrinsically real in themselves, but we have to assume they are real in order to be able to communicate with other people, in order to have a conversation, in order to communicate. So being mindful of what we are unaware of, paradoxically, allows us to notice things that we would normally ignore. and things that we normally ignore tends to create inconsistencies and maybe dysfunctions in our minds, because our minds lacks consistency. Yeah, it lacks certainty. It's not very comfortable with the unknown or with doubt or the mind of a child likes things to be consistent, even if it's painful. So long as it's consistent, it's kind of tolerable. Yeah, what is intolerable is the inconsistencies, yeah, and the arbitrariness. Yeah, so even an artificial inconsistency, seems much more comfortable. But if we're going to sort of go beyond that, then we have to be able to tolerate inconsistencies. In fact, we have to look for inconsistencies, look for anomalies, feel the discomfort, work through that. And if we can do that, my experience is we have a broadened sense of the diversity of reality. That consistency is useful, but reality doesn't have to conform to our notions of what it should be or what it ought to be. It just is, and we have to sort of work within that limitation. Yeah. So again, taking the map analogy, if you have a map of the world, apparently the map will show you that the world is flat. Yeah. And if the map you have is in Britain, it will have the United States on one end and Russia at the other end. So it will assume that the furthest distance is between Russia and America. But if you have a different map, let's say of the Japanese map, they center their map around their island. And if you look at that map, you'll see that the United States and Russia are right next to each other. And Alaska is part of the United States, and it used to belong to Russia before they sold it. Yeah. So if you believe the map, you will sort of, things will appear real that are not. Things will appear inconsistent. How can one end of the world be right next to the other end of the world? It should be the furthest part. Yeah, it's just a map. Yeah, and all maps have that property. They distort the reality of the thing. So if you assume that the world is a globe, which a lot of people don't, some people still think the world is flat. Yeah, but if you assume that the world is round and that all maps distort, then the question is not which is the right map, it's different maps stress different things. One map is good for navigation of the sea. Another map shows the land areas accurately. Another map shows the sizes of various continents relatively accurately. So all maps are accurate up to a point, but they also have built-in distortions within them. So we can sort of, when we sort of examine the Dharma has to use concepts, symbols, and that inevitably introduces distortions. And part of studying the Dharma is looking for those inconsistencies and sort of broadening our views so that we can hold those inconsistencies and transcend them. That's really what transcendence means. It means going beyond. So it's not, it's this or that. It's more like it's both and neither. Yeah. So things being both and neither sort of feeds into the current theories of quantum physics, in which things, particles are not particles, they just appear. We can describe things as particles, or we can describe things as waves, but they are not waves and they're not particles. They're just appearances. They're just conventions. They're just models that makes it easier to grasp what's going on. Uh, so when we talk about things being inconceivable, yeah, yeah, the label inconceivable is a conception. Yeah, the label limitless is limited. Yeah, yeah. Labels by their nature, they have constraints on them. So when you talk about something that's not constrained, yeah, it becomes an idea, and so you have to hold it quite lightly, not too obsessively, not holding onto it, not looking for it as a kind of solid, permanent things on which you can base your life on. Uh, so later in the Heart Sutra, in the rendering, in the Puja book, it says, "Know that the bodhisattva, holding to nothing whatever, but dwelling in prajna wisdom, is freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it, and reaches clearest nirvana." So I just want to explore that. So let's just look at it. Let's go in reverse. It's freed of delusive hindrance, rid of the fear bred by it. Okay. So one way of sort of pointing our mind towards the truth is noticing our fear. Yeah, our fear will point to our delusive hindrance. Yeah, and in my experience, most people are not very comfortable with fear, or sort of staying with fear. So for me and a lot of men, it's much more acceptable to be angry than to be fearful. Yeah. So I've sort of, I've investigated with other people, and it's like anger protects fear. Anger protects fear. Behind anger, there's usually fear. There's usually an anxiety. Yeah. Uh, uh, and so any sort of strong feelings of hatred, revulsion, has that element to it. And so if we practice, we can sort of turn our minds towards what we fear, yeah? Or turn our mind towards rage or anger. Because again, we can sort of label anger, as bad. We shouldn't feel angry. We are Buddhists. We shouldn't be experiencing this. But it's more like we can use those as indicators, signs as to, oh, something is going on here. So when I'm feeling angry, what is the fear behind that? If we don't investigate, we just assume that it's because they did this or they said that, that's why I'm angry. And we just stop at that surface level. But if we can meditate or reflect, what is it that offends me? What is it that makes me angry? And then go deeper into that. And what I would suggest is that if you go deeper, you will see, there's a fear there, there's an anxiety. There's something I'm holding on to that gives me a sense of protection or safety, okay? And then we can then go further and say, well, is it necessary? Is it necessary to feel safe? And at one level, yes, as children, we need to feel safe. But as adults, it's actually okay not to feel safe. Okay? It doesn't mean that you sort of seek danger. Danger will come wherever. Yeah, it's more like we don't need to run away from our fears. We don't need to run away from other people's anger. We don't need to run away from uncomfortable feelings. Yeah, so we don't need to escape from discomfort. What would happen if we were able to examine our discomfort, tolerate it, accept it, and then through that acceptance, go beyond it? For me, in practice, you can't do that until you at least experience the discomfort, experience whatever your feelings are, and at least have a connection, a kindly awareness of that. And that sort of kindly awareness comes about through the practice of ethics, through the practice of meditation, especially going on solitary retreats or going on long retreats in which you reduce the amount of inputs. And so the mind is not occupied so much with thoughts and concepts. And there's this kind of spaciousness in which, by not doing anything in particular, the compulsive thinking that we're kind of used to stops, or at least suspends for a bit. And we get a different perspective of what reality can be like without thought. And again, this leads to a paradox. For the last couple of days, I've been trying to think about how to express going beyond thought. And I was thinking all the time about it. It's like, all right, okay, I've been here before. It's not that it's a waste of time, but it's not helpful. What I need to do is to be a bit more spontaneous, not to plan exactly what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it. And just take you on a meandering journey into my mind, maybe your mind, and just posit that, there is a possibility that you can be aware without thinking. Yeah. So it's not that there's thought and then you're thoughtless. We usually use the word thoughtless for somebody who's not thinking and just acts out of habit. So there's habit, or what I would call habitual thinking, which is more like, having the radio on 24 hours a day. So you can turn the volume down or up, but it's there all the time. And being free of thought is like you actually switch it off and you actually experience some silence. And then once you've experienced silence, you can switch it back on because it will come back on. But you now know that there's another possibility, that thinking doesn't have to be compulsive. It doesn't have to create emotional pain, or what makes a thought painful, is just a thought. But if you've experienced being present, as Eckhart Tolle would say, being present, you don't need to think. You just respond. Yeah, it's not that you are reacting, and it's not that the world disappears and you become a mindless zombie. It's more like you see things more clearly because your mind is not beclouded by fear, by desire, by the need to be right or the need to prove other people wrong. You don't have a view, or at least if you have a view, it's a view, it's a perspective, and you're not holding on to it. You're not clinging onto it. The very clinging sort of creates suffering, and a mind that is suffering cannot think clearly, cannot experience the totality of life directly, because it's always filtered by the past. This happened in the past. I hope it doesn't happen again. Or it's happened in the past. I want it to happen again, and it's not happening, and it should be happening, and all that. So there's a kind of constant for me. There can be a constant monologue or even dialogue with myself, and that's just draining of a lot of energy. And when the mind is not chattering all the time, that energy that would go into the internal chatter, with the internal dialogue, with the internal conflict, then allows something else to happen. And the response is creative. There's no thought behind it. There's no what's in it for me. That is usually behind most thoughts. What's in it for me? What are the benefits? Yeah. So a bodhisattva is moving towards being a bodhisattva is sort of noticing when you have mixed motives. Yes, like yes, I'm doing something good, but behind that good, they say, what's in it for me? Who's going to pat me on the back and tell me how great I am? And then if that doesn't happen, feeling, well, how dare they, here I am being good, and they're not even noticing that, and that has its own dynamic as well, switching from one polarity to the other, So I'm either very good. When I'm very good, I'm very good. But then if nobody notices I'm very good, then I go into a temper tantrum and then become very bad. So, well, I might as well be bad because nobody's going to appreciate me being good. Yeah. Yeah. So, it's that sort of childlike mentality. And that childlike mentality is part of who we are, but it doesn't have to be all of who we are. We can sort of create a gap. We can create a gap in which sort of we notice the chatter, we notice we have a grip, a holding on, and that grip of holding on creates pain. And then that pain justifies itself. I must think about it. I must think about it, and then the pain will go away. But that pain doesn't need to go away. If you can stay with the pain of a thought or the pain of a disappointment, sort of notice it, be with it, reflect on it, and notice that it's not permanent. It may seem permanent, but it isn't permanent. Suffering is not permanent. Pleasure is not permanent. It doesn't have to be consistent. It's helpful if it's consistent. We would like it to be consistent. But what happens if we don't mind? If we turn our mind into a different perspective, and that turning of our mind is practice. It's a practice of meditation. It's the practice of ethics. Noticing. For me, noticing that some of my ethical behaviors are rooted in the me and what's in it for me, and will people notice? Yes, now I'm a proper order member. What will all the other members think? So like, okay, why do I care what other people think? Really, why do I care what other people think? Yeah, somewhere behind that, there's a need for approval. This may be an overgeneralization, but I think observing a lot of people that, we are approval junkies. We are brought up as children wanting the approval of parental figures, and we sort of carry that on into our adulthood. And then we carry that on into our spiritual life, looking for spiritual mothers and fathers. They are fine, but they will disappoint, and that's okay because they're also going through their maturing process. Yeah. But just being aware that, you're projecting onto other people and sort of taking responsibility for that gives me a much more relaxed perspective, a less clingy, holding position. And within that framework, I can allow people to be just as they are without needing to judge them, without needing to judge myself. Because what I do to others, I do to myself. Yeah. So, yeah, if you can let go of this sense of holding, of this sense of judging, of this sense of having to be right or having to prove other people wrong, we can come into a different relationship with ourselves and with other people. Yeah. So in conclusion, it's by holding to nothing whatever that we can sort of dwell in wisdom, in transcendence, while it lasts. So also knowing that it's not permanent either, and that's fine. Yeah, yeah. And it's itself, it's a process, you know. It's not that once I've got wisdom, that is it. It's not a thing that we hold. It's more like a flow we tune into, and we notice when we're out of tune with it. And then once we've noticed, that very awareness allows us to come back into contact with it. Yeah. So reality is more of a flow rather than as a rigid thing that we have to hold on to. And then, you know, this is it. It's more like, oh, yes, reality has changed and I have to change in accordance with reality, rather than expecting reality to conform to, this is my model, this is the way it should be. And if it isn't that, I'll be unhappy. You know, yeah. So thank you very much. I think I've talked over long as usual, and I haven't said quite as much as I would like to say, but I hope this has given you a taste of where I am in my practice.
Thank you so much, Nandaraja. But paradoxically, it's such a thought-provoking talk. There's lots to reflect on there. And so we've got just under 10 minutes for questions. So I suggest that perhaps we, maybe we can do it, either people can write questions in the chat box, or if you'd prefer to just raise a hand and I'll come to you when I see the hands. Does that sound okay? So we've maybe got time for a few questions, maybe 3 or 4, depending on the length. Oh, Annie. And you can unmute yourself, I think, or I can unmute you.
Is there a practice you favour for hitting the off button for thinking?
Yes, but there's a lot. It's a long process. Okay, so like most things, there's not a shortcut. But the okay. So first, I start with at least an hour of the mindfulness of breathing, and then an hour of the metta bhavana, and then an hour of just sitting. And then, okay, so this is one after the other. So this only works well if you're on solitary, or if you're like me, you're semi-retired and you can sort of spend half a day, you know, doing nothing, you know, you've got nothing sort of particular to do. So having sort of established a foundation of mindfulness, metta, and just sort of just sitting, just broad awareness, then you can sort of start investigating the nature of thought. So thoughts arises, and then what tends to happen is that a thought arises, and then there's a thought that says, I'm thinking, yeah? But the thought that says, I'm thinking, is just another thought. Yeah, it's a kind of thought that tries to hold on to other thoughts and says, you know, since all these thoughts arises, there must be a thinker that's having all these thoughts, and that thought and that thinker must be me. You know? So you have a thought that tries to dominate all the other thoughts. Yeah, and if you can sort of go beyond and see the hilariousness of a thought thinking, it can control other thoughts while the other thoughts are wriggling around and doing their own. You know, it's like my thoughts have thoughts of their own. You know, it's like, yeah, they just proliferate. Yeah. And then if you can see the kind of absurdity of that, in that absurdity, you can sort of go into a kind of stillness in which thoughts drop. And then when that thought drops, after a while, a thought arises that says, hey, I'm still thinking, which is another thought. And then you have to start all over again. Yeah, yeah. But just, you know, just having that sort of hilariousness of the mind constantly having to do something because it's just afraid of not existing. You know, it's like, oh, you know, at least I'm in pain, therefore I exist. You know, at least I'm uncomfortable, therefore, you know, there's a reason for me having these thoughts. But another way is just to ask, is this an original thought? You know, most thoughts are quite repetitive. You know, just the same thought. You had it sometimes, and you never resolved it, so they're going to come up again. But if you can sort of follow a thought, the chain of thoughts right to the end, then at the end of that, there's a kind of, oh, that's it, that's the end, you know. And then you can sort of notice the pattern, the chains of thoughts that sort of led to that. And then you can say, oh, right, I'm here in that thought process, you know. Oh, there's resentment that will eventually lead to guilt or hatred, you know. Do I want to go there? Yeah, because I know where that thought leads, you know. And then you can sort of, oh, right, I don't need to go there. And then I say, oh, why don't you try this other one then? Yeah. So it's not that you end thought by thinking about ending thought. It's more like you see how thought proliferates itself, prapancha, how it proliferates, how thought leads to more thinking, and then the thinking of having or not having that thought leads to even more thinking, and you just wrap yourself into a Gordian knot, and you're just cutting through that. So, oh, this is hilarious, you know, this is, you know, yeah. And then that sort of laughter, you know, oh, yeah, there's a freedom. I don't have to think. It's a choice rather than a compulsion. Yeah, I don't have to solve it. I don't have to solve life. I don't have to solve suffering. You know, it's there. It's okay. It's uncomfortable, but the sensation is tolerable. The thought, you know, this is impossible or this is intolerable, is just another thought, another distraction. So it's more like be mindful of distractions, how your mind distracts itself from the present moment. You know, and using thought as a sort of technique of having to avoid the present moment. Yeah, look for boredom. That's usually a good sign. Look for boredom.
All right, we've got a question from Susan. Susan, would you like to unmute yourself?
Oh, thank you so much. I've been struggling with all these ideas recently, and I've got some real insight thanks to your insights pouring at me. I've managed to create a practice which, if you like, you know, following all of the sorts of ideas that you've been talking to us about, which protects myself. But what I'd like to ask you, how do you take this way of protecting ourselves from judgment, from realizing the limitations of concepts and labels, but how do you take it into the political arena? Because, you know, people, for example, who create great hurt on sentient beings, not just me, but other people, they aren't people I hate, but I hate the conditions that have created people who act in a way which creates great, great pain. And I just wondered if you could help me with being a political animal as well as a Buddhist in, you know, respecting and understanding these ideas, really in order to protect myself, but I still am moved to participate in change.
Okay. Again, it's not an either or, and the problem is this sense of protecting yourself. Again, so it's more like pain is acceptable. You will experience pain, but you don't need to experience suffering. Yes. So suffering is something we add onto our direct pain. Yeah. Okay. So we can have a sense of having a painful conversation or a painful interaction. Yeah. but this is where meditation, it's more like if you can experience it at the time, that experience in itself changes. But if you can't, reflecting on what is it that makes this painful, what makes this idea painful, or what makes this behavior painful, and what is the other person protecting? Yeah.
Yes.
What is the other person protecting? What are they clinging on to that's causing you pain? And do you need to accept the assumptions that they're imposing on the conversation or in the construct? Yeah. So again, it's not like the Buddha wasn't political. He had to interact. He had to interact with kings and various other people.
Yes.
There were people who tried to frame the Buddha for things he hadn't done and things like that. Yeah. Okay. But it's not making enemies out of them. That seems to be the important thing, or at least noticing when you're making enemies that is what you're doing. Yeah. And just because they make you into their enemies doesn't mean that you have to make them into your enemies.
Yes.
So it's more like them not leading the conversation. So you taking your power back. That okay, you may not like me, and I may not like you, but insofar as I don't like you, that's a reflection of me not liking myself, because we have a tendency to think it's other people that are evil or bad or ignorant. Somehow we are exempt from that.
No. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's really helped me. Thank you.
Yes, having a sense of humility. Yeah. But also standing your ground. So so this is my position. Yeah. But being willing to change, to examine it. Yeah. And using the other person as a way of examining your own position to see how true to reality it is, or how accurate it is. All maps are conventions, and they have to be updated. If you don't update them, it creates a lot of confusion.
They certainly do. I'm a sailor, and I don't. Thank you.
So just to say, it's past 5 o'clock, so we should probably stop, although I'm sure we could go on talking about this for a long, long time. So I just want to say thank you so much to Nandaraja, and thank you so much for the questions. Maybe, because we didn't do this at the beginning, maybe if everyone feels like unmuting yourselves and just saying thank you or goodbye in whatever way you'd like, that's always a nice way to finish.
Thank you.
Sadhu.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Nandaraja.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Because I must stop.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thanks.